Welcome to this online lesson looking at evacuation and the Blitz in World War II. First of all, an introductory activity. Have a look at this picture. Firstly, what does this source show? You can just describe what you can see going on. And secondly, how can this tell us about the reactions to the threat of bombing in World War II? Pause the video now while you have a go at this, and bear in mind if you've never encountered this topic before, you're going to have to work with a certain amount of guesswork. Okay, so this picture clearly shows some very young children, babies and toddlers really, being held aloft by a couple of men. They're not their fathers though, or at least it's very unlikely that they are, and one of them is quite clearly very upset. Here are a couple of really key specific details though that you might have picked up on. Notice that some of the children are wearing little labels. These labels would have had their names, their addresses, and also where they were supposed to be being evacuated to. And where are they being evacuated, and how do we know that they're being evacuated? Well, you might recognise that symbol on the caps there. There are 3 in total in this picture. This is the London Underground symbol. Yes, the children were unaccompanied, moved by rail into the countryside to escape the expected bombing. This happened very early in World War II, as it was expected that cities would be a target right from the beginning. This wasn't quite true in the event. However, the government didn't hang around, and the safety of children was very much a priority. So the title of today's lesson is Escaping the Blitz, Evacuating the Children. Our aims are to know the process of evacuating the children, to interpret sources relating to evacuation, and to evaluate the effectiveness of evacuation. This poster here is typical of those posters that encourage people to evacuate their children out of the cities. It was produced by the Ministry of Health in 1940. "Leave Hitler to me, sonny. You ought to be out of London," says the soldier to the boy. As a bit of an introduction then, fill in these headings: content, origin and purpose. For content, describe what the source says or shows. For origin, note down who made it and when, and you'll need to have a look at the caption for that one there. And for the purpose, explain why the source was probably made, written or published. Pause the video while you have a go at that, but only spend at most about 5 minutes doing it. Okay, so for the content you should have picked up on the following details. We can see a soldier in the foreground with a young boy who's pretending to be a soldier with his sword and toy gun. In the background we can see a bombed out building, suggests that this is in the middle of the Blitz when the Germans were bombing cities. And a Union Jack is flying, a little touch of patriotism for this wartime poster. It also contains the text, "Leave Hitler to me, sonny, you ought to be out of London." Notice that "you" is underlined, so we have got the idea that this is the soldier who's addressing the little boy, saying it's all very well for us adults to be here at risk, but there's no need for the children to be. So who made it and when? Well, that's in the caption. Made by the Ministry of Health in the year 1940. And what was the purpose? Well, it was probably to encourage children, or more likely to encourage their parents, to ensure that their children were evacuated away from the bombing in London. Firstly, we need to consider, why did the Blitz happen? Blitz is a German word meaning lightning. For the British, this was a shortened word from the word Blitzkrieg, which they'd become familiar with, which meant lightning war, and really describes the shock tactics used by the German army at the start of the war. However, for the British civilians, this was later applied to the German bombing raids on cities like London. The first major raid on London was on the 7th of September 1940, or at least the first major deliberate raid on London. Some stray bombs had landed on the city somewhat before this time. So we're going to really ask the question, what made London a target? In some ways this might seem like a straightforward question, but in fact there are several key reasons why London was such a target for bombing for the Germans. What you're going to do is you're going to create a double-page mind map like the one below, or you could just list down headings and create notes underneath those. You will find the information on this screen, and you'll be able to use about 3 to 4 minutes per screen to note down some facts for each one. So make sure you pause the video when you need to. First of all though, pause the video while you create your mind map, or write down the headings so that you can structure your notes. The overall heading is what made London a target, and the 5 subheadings are government, trade, industry, population and geography. Pause the video while you complete that. Okay, let's have a look at our first category. Firstly, here's one of the most famous pictures from the Blitz. It shows one of the most famous and distinctive landmarks from London's skyline, St Paul's Cathedral. This picture shows fires surrounding St Paul's Cathedral. You can see burned out buildings in the foreground, where it's only the front walls lining up, and you can see their windows are illuminated by the fires within them. But St Paul's itself rises above the smoke, seemingly undamaged. This was deliberate. Great efforts were put into saving St Paul's at the expense of the buildings around it. And that was important. It was recognised that the symbolic importance of a building like St Paul's Cathedral was more important than the practical importance of the buildings that surrounded it. And that's related to our first category. Key factor number 1. Government. Here we can see Winston Churchill giving his famous V for Victory salute. No, it's not quite the rude gesture, but it appears. And underneath that we can actually see a picture of part of the Palace of Westminster which has been hit by a bomb. London was and is the capital city of the United Kingdom. The Luftwaffe, that's the German Air Force, reckoned that the widespread destruction of the centre of government of the United Kingdom would seriously harm Britain's ability to continue fighting the war. On one end of the scale, British government and morale would be devastated if Churchill, his war cabinet, or even the royal family were killed. Morale refers to the happiness of the population, which is related to their willingness to carry on fighting. On the other end of the scale, killing government workers and civil servants would slow down government and make the war harder to continue. Essentially, it would mean that vital work of government would not be taking place, or it would be slowed down. A related issue was the fact that significant landmarks like Buckingham Palace or the Houses of Parliament might be destroyed, harming civilian morale and happiness even further. Indeed, both the Houses of Parliament and Buckingham Palace were hit by bombs during German bombing raids. So, it's time to fill in some sections on your mind map or under your notes. Add at least 3 specific facts to your notes and mind map explaining why government made London such a target. Pause the video for about 3 to 4 minutes while you do that. Let's have a look at the next section. Our next section is on trade. In the photograph, we can see the Port of London Authority handing out some tea to dock workers with a steamship in the background. Although large ships no longer dock in London, in the 1940s it was arguably the most important port in all of the United Kingdom. Although that changed once its vulnerability to air raids was established and ports like Liverpool became more important. Although more famous for trading stocks and shares these days, London was Britain's most important port in World War II. Although, as I've said, the Battle of the Atlantic was increasing the importance of Liverpool and Bristol. Destroying the docklands of East London would seriously harm Britain's ability to keep itself fed, and hungry civilians would be less likely to continue the fight. Raids might also destroy large stockpiles of weapons and supplies being taken off the ships. There was also the possibility of killing the important dock workers too, which would slow down the transportation of vital goods into the country. So again, like you did last time, spend between 3 and 4 minutes adding at least 3 specific facts or examples to your notes or mind map. Pause the video while you do this. And onwards. Factor number 3 is industry. Here we can see a British Matilda tank being taken out of a tank factory by a small steam engine. Although there weren't that many weapons factories in London, there were some significant sites, as we'll see. Although not famous for massive mills and factories like Manchester and Birmingham, London was an important centre of industry. Factories producing weapons such as Woolwich Arsenal and the Enfield Small Arms Factory were important war industries. Killing civilian workers would also lower morale and harm the production of vital goods, including war goods. London was also the centre of the British railway network, which is crucial for the nation's transport system. This can be seen in this map of 1900, showing what the British railway network looked like at this time. In fact, the British railway network had changed very little between 1900 and 1940, and you should be able to see how, right down there in the southeast corner, most of the railway lines are feeding into London. If London is badly hit and the railways there damaged, it has a serious knock-on impact on the rest of the railway network. This can be easily forgotten in these days when we rely on the railways so much less. Indeed, these subsequent maps show how the railway network has shrunk since the days of the Second World War. Firstly, with the so-called Beeching Acts in 1963, and how it looks today. But even still, these maps show how the networks are feeding largely into places like London. And so in some respects, this map makes it even clearer the point that I'm making. Anyway, time to update your notes. Again, at least 3 specific facts or examples onto your notes or mind map. Pause the video while you do this. Okay, 2 more sections to go. Point number 4 relates to population and the people who lived in London. London was the UK's biggest city with 6.8 million inhabitants in 1939. That was a truly huge city by the standards of the day. When Stanley Baldwin, a British politician, reasoned that killing civilians alone could win a war, Germany and other nations agreed. Effectively, what Stanley Baldwin said in the 1930s was that the bomber would always get through, and that there was no power on earth that could prevent the man in the street from being bombed. That wasn't quite true, but it was believed enough by enough nations that civilians were considered legitimate targets in war. Here the process is brutal and simple. Kill as many civilians as possible. Injure and maim as many civilians as possible. Maim means to badly injure, perhaps making them lose a leg or an arm. And make homeless as many civilians as possible. The resulting horror and lowering of morale or happiness would, it was supposed, be enough to force the UK to surrender. Okay, a bit of a spoiler here. The morale never actually cracked badly enough that Britain needed to leave the war. I mean, that should be obvious. We're probably aware that the British and their allies won the Second World War. And indeed the Germans were far more heavily bombed than the British, and they didn't give up because of just bombing either. They needed to be invaded. I'm getting a little bit away from the point here, but really what this is all about is the number of people in London, and making them a target was seen as a way of winning the war, even though we now know it didn't really work. Time to add to your notes again. Pause the video while you do so. Last category coming up. Before I introduce this last category, it's worth bearing in mind the effects on ordinary people. This is a colorised photograph of a little boy who's lost his entire family. It's quite clear that he's in shock and is clutching onto one of his stuffed toy animals just for a bit of comfort, whilst people search through the rubble in the background. The experience of ordinary Londoners in this time must have been truly horrific. But this little boy clearly wasn't evacuated, and that's going to be part of our lesson later on. This map helps explain our last category. It shows the southeast of England with some of the main air bases listed on, including the German ones in northern France. Don't forget that France had been invaded by the Germans at this point, and so French bases had now become German ones. Despite where the German raid is marked on this particular map, which shows the Battle of Britain, which happened a bit before the Blitz, the typical route of German bombers was to fly out over the North Sea and then up the Thames Estuary to London. This put them out of the range of the anti-aircraft guns and some of the fighters which was stationed in the south east of England. Also, London was incredibly easy to find, as we'll see, because our last category is geography. This photograph shows an aerial view of London in the 1940s. Still quite a recognisable view today with the famous bridges. London could hardly have been in a worse place to defend for the British. It was very close to the German bomber bases in occupied France. Indeed, even German fighters were in range of London during the day. Added to this, by approaching over the North Sea and Thames Estuary, the bombers would spend limited time in range of anti-aircraft guns. When bombers switched to night raids, the Thames would reflect moonlight and fires, showing the way to the centre of London like a map. London was easy to find, easy to reach, and easy to hit. Imagine you're in a German bomber flying out over the Thames Estuary. You would have been able to see the River Thames almost pointing like an arrow to the centre of London. Just fly up that river and drop your bombs when you get there. It could hardly be simpler, even at night and even with all the lights in people's houses blacked out. You know the drill by now? Add at least 3 specific examples to your notes or mind map. Pause the video while you do this. Just as a bit of a follow-up, these are some structures that are still in the Thames estuary to this day. There's several sites with them, and they are visible from certain parts of the southeast coast. What on earth are they? Well, believe it or not, these are the remainders of what was called the Maunsell Fort system. These were anti-aircraft forts which were built right out in the middle of the sea. The idea was that the German bombers who were trying to avoid anti-aircraft guns by flying over the sea in the Thames estuary wouldn't be able to do so if these guns were here. They never shot down that many bombers, but they certainly gave the German crews something to think about and occasionally made them rush or miss their targets. We're now going to consider what sort of targets were actually hit. I've mentioned London so far, but it would be unfair to suggest that just London was bombed during the Second World War. Many major cities, and indeed some smaller cities, were hit by bombs at various points during the war. This shows the cathedral city of Canterbury. Okay, this is the modern Google map, but I've added on some of the other details, like I've labelled what was in each location within the city in the 1940s. You've got 3 different railway lines, you've got lots of housing, you've got railway stations, hospitals, a ruined abbey, Canterbury Cathedral, shops and high street, and all sorts of different things. Take a moment to study this map and consider where you would aim for if you were in a German bomber to do maximum damage to the British war effort. Give it some thought now. I wonder who was aiming for the housing, perhaps trying to undermine civilian morale. Or perhaps you want to damage morale by hitting things like the cathedral. Or perhaps the gasworks, causing maximum damage. Well, now I'm going to overlay where the bombs actually hit, and it might surprise you. Each one of these dots represents a single high explosive bomb that was dropped on Canterbury during the Second World War. What you should be able to see is that the dropping of bombs is pretty random. It should be remembered that bombing at this time was not necessarily a very precise science, especially when bombers were flying at night. Typically, they would try and drop their bombs somewhere in the general area of the target and then get out of there as quickly as they possibly could. A couple other interesting variations on this map. Firstly, this symbol here shows where a V1 flying bomb landed in 1944. V1s were pilotless bombs which were very difficult to shoot down. This one would have been on its way to London, but must have been hit by an anti-aircraft gun or fighter. And here's a German bomber that didn't make it home. A Junkers Ju-88 bomber crashed into the outskirts of Canterbury next to the old Dover Road. The point is, though, the Germans were not aiming for any particular location. They were just aiming for the city itself. That meant that nobody was safe. You couldn't just say, I'm in a residential area, and the bombers would be aiming for the cathedral or for one of the hospitals. Anywhere could be hit. Now let's apply this to a larger map. Here's the city of Plymouth in southern Devon. Again, have a think where you would aim for if you were a German bomber crew. And here we see the map that shows where the bombs actually landed. The fact of the matter is that the German bombers would aim anywhere, but on this map it appears that the docks and the naval dockyards were missed altogether. That's not actually true, it's simply that these details of damage would not have been released for fear of giving sensitive information away. Interestingly, on this map, one thing that is more clear that wasn't clear on the Canterbury map is how that we've got rows of high explosive bombs. These had been dropped by a single aircraft on its bombing raid. However, these are not the only bombs dropped on these cities. Thousands upon thousands of incendiary or fire bombs, which were simply designed to burn very brightly and set buildings on fire, would have been dropped. But because these were so small and so numerous, you can't really plot on a map exactly where they landed. So if you lived in a city, potentially you were a target, and there was very little you could do about it but hope for the best. This couple here, getting married in 1935, are my great-grandparents. You might be wondering why I'm showing you a picture of them. Well, here's my great-gran, who I knew very well before she died in 2008, with my granny, who's the little girl standing up, and my great-uncle, who's the little boy, a baby. They had 2 children and lived a very happy life in the Devon countryside just outside of Holsworthy. Again, why am I showing you this? Well, their children didn't need to escape the bombing. They were pretty safe away from it. However, they did voluntarily take in 2 evacuees from the city of Plymouth, which you've just seen. So why did they end up taking in these children? The fact is, people in the countryside often felt a duty to, and there was a national drive to evacuate children away from the dangerous cities and into the safety of the countryside. As it happens, my great-grandfather, who was a little bit too old to fight in the war, ended up working in carpentry for the British Army and was away for the majority of the war. So my great-gran had to raise 4 children, 2 of them not her own, on her own, for the duration of the Second World War. I remember speaking to her about this. She found it absolutely exhausting, but she was grateful to be doing her bit. Evacuation. Between 1939 and 1940, 3.5 million people were evacuated from cities and other at-risk areas. In the first 3 days of World War II, so that's September the 1st to September the 3rd, 1939, Operation Pied Piper relocated 827,000 children from London and other cities. They were sent to rural areas which were considered safe from air attack, rural meaning the countryside. 1/3 of the country was considered at risk. These were typically the cities and the ports. 1/3 was considered neutral, where there might be some risk but not a great risk. And 1/3 was classed as a reception area. In other words, they would receive the evacuees. These were the rural areas that would receive the evacuees and were considered safer from bombing. Evacuees were sent to stay with families in rural communities until it was judged that the danger of bombing had passed. But although 3.5 million people were relocated, it is estimated that over half of them returned to their homes at some point during the war. Homesickness must have been a very powerful pull for them. Here are some tasks based upon this then. We're going to sum up this information under 5 headings, the 5 W's. So this is a handy revision technique that you can use. Summarise the information on this screen under these headings. Who, what, where, when and why. In other words, write down who was affected by this move to evacuate people. What actually happened to them? Where did it tend to happen, remembering that the country was divided up into 3? And when did it happen? Look for any dates. And why did it happen? Why did the government encourage evacuation? It's quite a quick task this, and about 5 to 10 minutes should be plenty of time for you to fill in these 5 different headings. Pause the video while you do so. So, for who it affected, then we should have noted down children. What happened? Children were sent from the cities, what were considered at-risk areas, and they were sent to the reception areas in the countryside. Where did it happen? Well, it happened between these 3/3 of the country. So the part of the country that was considered at risk is where the children were from, and they were sent to the reception areas in the rural countryside. Operation Pied Piper happened between the 1st to the 3rd of September of 1939, although evacuation did carry on after that as well. And why did it happen? Because of the fear of air attack. Note that actually at this point, British cities had not yet been attacked. This was all about preparing for the worst. Add anything to your notes that you've missed, and then we'll move on. We're now going to consider the experience of evacuees. But to do this, we're going to consider the usefulness of sources too. Let's have a look at our first example. Source A is a recollection of a man called Jim Woods, remembering his life as an evacuee to Wales from Lambeth in London. He wrote this source in the year 2000. That would have been about the 60th anniversary of him being moved away. He was 5 years old when he was evacuated and would have been recording this at the age of 65. The first night we slept on the floor of the local church. The next day my sister and I were allocated to a Mr. and Mrs. Rees. At first it was quite frightening being separated from your mother and not understanding what was going on. However, after only a few days we settled down and quite enjoyed being in Wales. After living in London, we were now surrounded by countryside. The village we lived in was very small. There were mines close up and we had great fun exploring the slag heaps. My sister and I got on very well with Mr. and Mrs. Rees. So here we've got an old man, or an oldish man, who's recalling his life as a very young child being evacuated to Wales. Slag heaps, by the way, are all the waste piles from the coal mines that you used to get in South Wales. Pretty dangerous to be exploring, really, but people didn't necessarily care about that back then. Here are the circumstances to consider when we're thinking about how useful this source is to us. After all, we're trying to use it to find out what the experience of evacuees was like. We should consider Jim Woods' age at the time that he was evacuated compared to when he actually recalls this. Also, how long ago he was remembering these events, between when they happened and when he was writing them down in the year 2000. You should consider why people write accounts like this. As I mentioned, this would have been for the 60th anniversary of the Blitz, so it's likely that he was writing it down as part of that anniversary. But also, what information this source contains. Is it typical of what we know? Do we know that children of roughly Jim Woods' age were moved to rural areas like Wales away from big cities like London? Here's your tasks then. Read source A carefully, and I would say the circumstances to consider, and then answer the following questions. Write out a quote from the source, remembering your speech marks, that you think is believable. Explain why you trust this quote and think that it's something that really happened. But then, secondly, what circumstances might make the source A, trustworthy, in other words, make you believe the information that's in it, or B, not trustworthy, in other words, might give you a few doubts as to how accurate it is. Explain your view in each case. Take some time to do that and pause the video now. Hopefully you've been able to choose a quote, but let's think about the trustworthiness. One thing that might make it trustworthy is the fact that Jim Woods was actually there and is recording things that really happened to him, so in that respect it's a first-hand account. Another thing is it seems to reflect some of our knowledge of what happened during the Second World War. He was a young boy being moved from the at-risk area of London to the neutral, or probably more likely reception area of rural Wales. He seems to be recalling some quite specific details as well. He has powerful memories of it being frightening, and of this Mr. and Mrs. Rees, who he seems quite fond of. And even very young children can have powerful, long-lasting memories of these things. However, things that might make it less trustworthy is the fact that he's remembering events from so long ago. Consider that in those 60 years, certain details may have been missed, or he may just be remembering the good and happy memories, not the terror and the heartache of being separated from his family. Let's have a go at another source. Bit of a different one this time, from an older girl. And this one isn't written by someone remembering things, it was written at the time of the Second World War. When you deal with a source, it's always useful to read the provenance or caption which is included with every source that you'll study. Source B. Children evacuated to Oxford and Cambridge were asked to write essays explaining what they liked and disliked about their new homes. This is an extract from one of these essays written by a 13-year-old girl in 1941. She does like a bit of a moan, this girl. Not saying that about teenagers in general, but I think you'll enjoy it. There isn't much that I really like in Cambridge. I like the meadows and the parks in the summer, but it is too cold in the winter to go there. I miss my home in Tottenham, and I'd rather be there than where I am. I cannot find much to do down here. I miss my sister and my friends. I haven't any of my friends living in Newnham, where I live, and I never know where to go on a Saturday and Sunday, as I have no one to go with. At home I can stop in on a Saturday if it is cold, but I have to take my brother out because the lady in this house goes to work and sometimes it is too cold to go anywhere. I miss my cup of tea, which I always have at home after dinner. Oh, I miss my mother's cooking because the lady does not cook very well. Circumstances to consider with this source. The girl's age at the time she was writing. How long ago she was remembering from. Why she wrote this source, in other words the purpose of it. And what information the source contains. Is it typical of what you know? Jim Woods' account seemed to be quite positive. This one not so much. But that doesn't necessarily make it less useful or less believable. So similar tasks again. Read source B carefully and the circumstances to consider. Write out a quote again, remembering your quote marks. And then again, explain what circumstances might make this source trustworthy or believable and not trustworthy and not believable. Explain your view in each case. Again, pause the video while you do this. Hopefully you've chosen a believable quote again. So what might make this trustworthy? Well, not only was this written by someone who actually experienced it, but it was actually written at the time of the event, so she would have been recalling events that were actually still going on. That can make it trustworthy, as we don't have the same risk of key details being forgotten. But what might make it less trustworthy? Well, let's consider why she wrote this source. She was being made to write it by the school teacher. Does it appear that she enjoyed this task? It doesn't appear like it to me. It looks like she's having a bit of a moan for a moan's sake. And of course, that might be accurate in telling us that this girl didn't actually enjoy her experience of evacuation at all. But we don't know whether she was just having a bad day or being a little bit rebellious against a boring school topic, which is making this an unfairly negative account of the experience of evacuation. It's really hard to tell just from this source on its own. Improve some of your answers if you need to. If not, we'll move on. We're going to take this source a little bit further. It's the same one again, so I won't read it again. The task this time is, in a table like this one below, record the content or information from the source. For example, what it shows you. Then fill in column 2, provenance. This means the type and origin of the source. I've included some bullet points which give you an indication of what you should include in each heading. So for information, you should look at the obvious information, is she happy, what's she getting up to, and the inferences and less obvious info it suggests. So what does this suggest about the girl's reaction to evacuation and what she would like to be doing? Then for the provenance, who wrote the source? Have a look in the caption. When was it written? Have a look for any dates. And why do you think it was written? Look for the purpose of it. Once you've done that, you're going to do a short paragraph in a structured way, which will follow the usual point, example, explain structure, only with a couple more examples. You should start it like this. Source B is useful for a historian studying the experience of evacuated children. I'm not giving you the choice here. It is useful. So that's how we're going to start. An example of the information it gives us is, and give us an example of the information, and this tells us, and tell us what that informs you. An example of its provenance is, give an example of the provenance from your table. This makes it useful because, and remember when we're talking usefulness, it should be information that is relevant to evacuation that we actually trust and believe. Give that a try. Pause the video while you complete it. Done? Alright, let's move on. Source C. This is the last major source that we're going to have a look at. This time it's not a first-hand account by someone who was an evacuee, but rather someone who worked with evacuees at the time. This is from a survey by the National Federation of Women's Institutes in 1941. The Women's Institute, or WI as it's known, was a voluntary organisation which assisted with the evacuation process, among doing many other things for their local communities. In this instance, it was a voluntary organisation that tried to help the disadvantaged. This is what their report or survey recorded. The state of the children from Liverpool was such that the school had to be specially cleaned after they'd left it. Most of the children were filthy. Their clothing was in a terrible condition, some of the children being literally sewn into their ragged little garments. Some children from Manchester had never slept in beds. One boy from Salford had never had a bath before. Some Gosport children had never used a knife and fork. You can sort of sense the shock of these probably quite middle-class or upper-class women volunteers at their reaction of seeing the poverty that many of these disadvantaged city children had been living in before they were evacuated. So they felt it was notable and worth writing down. Here are our tasks again. We're going to fill out another table. What is the information in this in terms of both the obvious information and the inferences and less obvious information it suggests? For the inferences, think really hard about this. Why is it that the Women's Institute have thought that this is worthy of comment? And then the provenance. Who wrote the source? When was it written? And why do you think it was written? And then we're going to follow it up with another structured paragraph, but with a slightly different focus. Source C suggests that children may have benefited from being evacuated. That's just a fact. Some of them did. So we're going to use that as our point. An example of the information it gives us is, this tells us, an example of its provenance is, and then this suggested that some children benefited from evacuation because. Now the challenge here is that source doesn't actually say these children benefited. You're going to have to infer how they may have benefited from being evacuated. Pause the video while you have a go at those tasks, and number 2 might be a little bit trickier, so give it some real thought. So hopefully what we've identified here is that some people did in fact benefit from being evacuated. If they came from dreadful urban poverty, then evacuation offered at least a temporary route out of this. Many of evacuees would have got better food in the countryside than they would have got in their more impoverished families in the cities. Also, many of them would have got new clothes and had more regular washing. It's a real shame to think of all these children growing up in such abject poverty that these things were not provided for them before. But some children who were evacuated actually returned in a far healthier state than they had been when they lived in the cities. So the benefit for them was not just avoiding being blown to bits by a German bomb, it was actually having a higher quality of life. However, these children still often missed their families, and that meant that the pull of home was often too much. We're now going to compare some sources, and we're going to infer from these sources too. I'm going to show you two similar posters that were made at the same time but for differing audiences. Source D was produced by the Ministry of Health in 1939. It says, "Mothers, send them out of London. Give them a chance of greater safety and health." And you can see there's a picture of two children there. Then have a look at this second one. Very, very similar, isn't it? "Help the city children. Making a new home for evacuees is a national service issued by the Ministry of Health." So your tasks then. Who do you think is the audience of each source? And by audience I mean, who is it aimed at? Where do these people live? Where in the country would you expect to find each source put up? Thirdly, how does each poster try to encourage people to evacuate? And fourthly, why might source D focus on the health benefits? And how and why does source E appeal to a sense of patriotism? This is all about loving country and wanting to do your bit. Okay, none of those answers require too long an answer, but they do require a short answer each. So pause the video now while you complete them. We should have identified that the audience of source D would be mothers and families living in the cities. And source E would have been for families and people living in countryside or reception areas. So where would we expect to find each source? I would expect to find source D actually displayed in a city, and I would expect to find source E displayed in rural areas and in the countryside. How does each poster try to encourage evacuation? Well, source D is not saying mothers send them out of London for a greater chance of not being blown to bits by a German bomb, because that would have been too frightening. Instead, it's trying to encourage it based upon the health benefits that countryside living might offer for an impoverished family. On the other hand, the poster on source E is encouraging evacuation by saying that it's a national service that everybody should do as part of doing their bit for the war. Source D focuses on the health benefits, like I say, because it's less frightening than focusing on being blown to bits by the Germans. And source E appeals to a sense of patriotism by saying that by doing this, you're doing your bit. And if you read between the lines, if you refuse to accept evacuees, then you're not doing your bit for the war effort and people will think less of you. We're almost done now. Let's move on. So was evacuation successful? My great-grandmother and great-grandfather took in 2 evacuees from Plymouth in World War II in addition to their own 2 children. Perhaps it saved their lives. However, was evacuation a success? What is this source, the poster on the right, telling mothers to do? Secondly, what might this suggest about how successful evacuation was at getting children out of the cities, and we mean permanently? And as a challenge, why might some families not have wanted their children to have been evacuated, despite the fairly obvious dangers? Give that some thought and answer those questions, and pause the video while you do so. Firstly, we should have identified that this poster is trying to encourage mothers to keep their children in the countryside, rather than begging for them to come back or returning themselves, if, in the rare case, that they had actually been able to accompany them. We can see that this is implied that Hitler really wants them to go back to the city, because that's what he wants to do. He wants them in risk. He wants them dead. So don't do it, mother. Leave the children where they are. Leave them evacuated, safe and away from it all. So what might this suggest about how successful evacuation was? Well, actually, it should suggest to you that evacuation wasn't necessarily that successful. If it was, there would be no need for a poster telling people to keep their kids in the countryside. Clearly, many mothers and fathers had asked their children to return home, or children had begged to go home because they were so homesick. That's the thing, these people were human beings. They really missed their families, even with the danger. And that can be quite an irrational thing. While the rational brain would have been saying, I don't want to be blown to bits by a German bomb, the irrational and emotional side of people would have really missed their families and their homes and been desperate to return. After all, it's all too easy to think, it'll never happen to me. Finally, a local example, or at least it's local to me and my students. Like many rural areas, Great Torrington found itself in a reception area for evacuees from at-risk areas. One large house in the town, Sydney House, was home to over 50 evacuees. On the night of February the 19th, 1942, a fire broke out at the house. 54 evacuees were saved, but 5 boys were trapped in their attic room and died. Here we can see a newspaper clipping reporting on this. Sydney House is referred to as a school, but more accurately, it was a residential home for evacuated children. This, of course, is all the more tragic given how these boys were being evacuated away from the fires and bombs of the cities, only to die in a house fire in sleepy Torrington in North Devon. In 2002, a memorial stone was placed at the site of the old house. Here we can see that stone. Ronald Doolan, aged 8 years old, Collier's Wood, London. Geoffrey Drake, aged 8 years, who is from Uffculme. David Laurie, aged 8 years, who is from Teignmouth. Tom Shute, aged 7 years, from Brockley, also in London. And Peter Wilkinson, aged 7 years, from Paignton. Indeed, in 1942, coastal towns, even small ones like Teignmouth and Paignton, were targets for German hit-and-run raiders during daylight, so increasingly people were moved away from them. Your final task then. Explain why, despite this tragedy, it still made sense to evacuate children to the countryside, even if eventually around half of them returned home. Pause the video while you answer that final question. Ultimately, most people understood that while the cities were being heavily bombed, it made sense for children to be away. One thing I've not mentioned is that bombing was not constant throughout the Second World War. Initially, it was very heavy and absolutely terrifying and deadly, especially in cities like London. But from 1942 and into 1943, raids became less frequent. People became more desensitised to their terrifying effects, and therefore people were more prepared to risk having their children at home. After all, there was this feeling that it was never going to happen to them, even if sometimes, tragically, it did. So ultimately, evacuation is a famous part of World War II, but a slightly misunderstood one. German bombing was devastating, but at least with evacuation there were efforts to protect the nation's children. I hope that this lesson has been useful and interesting to you. If it has, then please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thanks very much for watching, and on this note we'll say goodbye.